Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good tidings, good salutations, good all the greetings for those who are listening. Welcome to Generational Archives, the show where we connect, heal, uncover through intergenerational conversations in archival research. I'm Dr. Raina León. I'm your scholar, your creative, your intuitive researcher, your tired person. I'm with my mom, Dr. Norma D. Thomas. How are you going to introduce yourself today?
Well, since you say I always introduce myself as Raina's mom, I'll just stick with that.
Oh, because you do other things. It's a very long bio. Trust. It's like a page long. Very impressive. We are also here with Je-Shawna Wholley. Am I pronouncing your last name? Okay, good.
Wholley.
Wholley. Okay, Je-Shawna Wholley, which I should know because I have been like following your work and also worked alongside. Who is our second guest because my father was the first guest. So I'm going to read Je-Shawna's bio. Je-Shawna is unapologetically Black and queer, and was born in North Carolina, radicalized in Atlanta, and is currently living in Chicago, Illinois. Hair and space making are at the center of her life's work. She thrives best when she is learning, serving, and growing at the intersections of Black healing and liberation movements, y'all. In 2022, she founded the Earthseed Black Family Archive Project, which is how Mommy and I both came into contact in connecting with Je-Shawna, who's one of the most skilled facilitators ever. Through Earthseed, Je-Shawna supports Black people who are interested in delving into their own family history work and community and creating something from what they find. She is an experienced facilitator, absolutely, helping groups integrate big ideas into practical action. Years of project management and curriculum building make her an ideal thought partner for those in need of deep impact programming, processes creation, and shifting through themes in order to produce creative and useful outcomes. So, Je-Shawna, I'm so glad that you said yes a while ago. We are delayed. My fault. But I'm so excited that you said yes and that we're finally in conversation. We always start out with a check-in question, and this one is, what do you hope 7 generations from now others will have learned from your life? You know, no big deal.
Well, first of all, I'm so happy to be here. It's an honor, a privilege, and just kind of surreal to be a part of this project. Having worked with you both separately on your own work, this is just what Earthseed is about. 7 generations from now, what do I hope people have learned from my life and work? I hope that 7 generations from now, people have learned that we're better together, that the healing work has to happen collectively and in community, and that they have learned that capitalism is not the way to go and has so many implications on our health, our mental well-being, our spiritual well-being. So I hope that 7 generations from now, we've created new ways of economy and commerce and new ways of supporting our livelihood.
I love that vision. I hope that it comes to fruition. How about you, Mommy? 7 generations from now, your life.
Well, mine is simple. I just want to have left a legacy that I made a difference one person at a time.
Yeah, you were telling a story earlier before we started recording about one person who...
Well, there was a newsletter put out from a community center in my hometown, and they were talking about her life. She was kind of raised in the community center, benefited from its services. It's one that my mother helped start. And she gave credit to a couple of people, and one was me, which surprised me that I had made such a difference in her life. And so when I communicated to the executive director to let her know that I appreciated the shout out, she said, "Oh, I just love her." So I just want to make a difference, one person at a time.
Yeah. I think I would echo both of you in some respects, and yet I think the distinctive thing is, for me, I hope that 7 generations from now, people will still remember me in connection with play and release, and the hard lessons of also like, oh, I have to do this in the end, and actually, no, you don't. You know, you can let it fall, because those are the structures that like bind us up within this capitalist model. As you said, release. It's okay to release. It's okay to rest. It's not just okay, it is beautiful and welcomed. And when we care about one another, we encourage that. We see one another when it's time to let it go and support one another, right?
But you actually have a hard time doing
I have a hard time. I have a really
Right.
hard time.
And that has been your whole life.
Yes, yes.
When you say to you that you don't have to add one more thing, you will add 5.
Yes, so that's the truth. Like I'm still working on this lesson, so I hope
Right.
that I've learned it.
7 generations from now, they may say you finally learned
I
that
learned
lesson.
it at the end. I might have been like 102. They were like, "Yeah, she finally learned to let things go," and she let it go.
No, I had a philosophy that if my children started something, they could not quit.
Yes.
And I finally said to Raina, "You could quit some of these things. You can quit because you're running me crazy, running after you with all these things." And then she would add stuff.
Yes.
And I said, "You complain about how stressed out you were,
Yes.
and now you added ballroom dancing and
Yes.
a new class."
I might have been 16 at the time, but still,
Oh
like,
my gosh. But it's
Yeah.
what you still do it.
that's true. I still do it. I still do it. I do think that it's so funny because my mom was, we were having this discussion before you came on, Je-Shawna, about, I had this conversation with my daughter today. And so we're walking to school and she coughs. And then she spits on the ground. This is my 3-year-old. And I was like, Yati, and I'm explaining, perhaps people like might not like you contributing your bodily fluids onto the ground. And so we talk about that. I'm like, who taught you this? Because it just come from me. And she like in this undertone is like, BB, which is
me. And I'm like, absolutely not. I did not teach your daughter that. I don't know why she said that. It didn't come from me.
So 7 generations from now, people might be like, who taught you to spit? BB.
That's how it starts. That's how folklore starts.
Okay, so let's transition to your work. I'm so excited for you to talk about like Earthseed and facilitating the work of others, but also your own individual artistic work and research work. So I sent you a whole bunch of questions. The first one, I am curious because especially when we first started the Generational Archives podcast, we focused on one ancestor, and through our discussion of what we learned about them, hope that we were inspiring people in the ways that we got to that information and sharing the story of those people. So I'm curious, what ancestor do you want us and those who listen to know about in this moment?
Yeah, I had to think about that because there are 2 ancestors that come to mind for different reasons. So the first ancestor is Grandma Maddie, who is my grandmother's grandmother.
Okay.
But my grandmother refers to her as Ma, because she actually raised my grandmother. She is the mother of my grandmother's father.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very interesting situation because my grandmother's father actually went off to war, came back with severe brain injury. I don't know the details of the relationship between he and my grandmother's mother, but they ended up breaking up. And then eventually he comes back and he kills my grandmother's mother.
Oh, wow.
and then goes to prison and receives the death penalty.
Wow.
So he ends up being murdered by the state. So my grandmother, this was when my grandmother was between 2 and 3 years old. So that's how she ends up getting raised by Grandma Maddie. And it becomes the foundation really for, I think, the story, like a lot of my life. That story is the foundation for the generations to come. And Grandma Maddie, I come to know Grandma Maddie through my mother, because my mother and her mother's relationship is very traumatic and taught. But whenever my mother would talk about nurturing in her life, whenever she would talk about where she felt safest, wherever she would talk about who actually mothered her, she would refer to Grandma Maddie.
Wow.
So that was actually my introduction into ancestors, into what it meant to honor, because I became curious about the woman that mothered my mother when her mother couldn't or wouldn't. And my mom is the first person that I came in contact with that actually talked about making contact with ancestors. Like she would talk about Grandma Maddie coming to visit her in her dreams. She would talk about Grandma Maddie, you know, leaving prophetic or kind of like signs, whether it's like scent. She would make these cookies, and every once in a while my mother could smell the cookies out of nowhere. She was just kind of always presented to me as like a guardian angel for my mom. And I've always been very protective of my mom, so I became very curious about this woman that was also protecting mommy. She had land out in North Carolina. You know, she and her husband, Grandpa Bright, you know, he worked out in the fields, and she would use her garden to feed him and everybody else who needed to be fed. You know, she's described as the woman that no child went hungry if they were around Grandma Maddie. But she was also described as the woman that when they came looking, the police came looking for her son, she went out to her steps with a shotgun and said, "You're going to have to get through me if you're trying to get to my son." And they just backed away because everybody knew Grandma Maddie was about that life. So she was a woman of great regard, a woman of great respect. I would argue she was also a root worker. I don't know if she would call herself that, but my mother talks about her going out into the back and getting the sap of a tree and wrapping it around a broken toe. And then 2 weeks later, the person's walking just fine, right? So yeah, she's the ancestor that I want everybody to kind of know about, this Black, fierce woman who, you know, despite it all, despite the gossip of the South that can happen in rural North Carolina when your son, you know, is charged with the heinous crime and, you know, then dies by the state, and then you take in his children anyway and you raise his children. You know, she did what was right for her and her family. And she outlived a lot of her children. So yeah, I do feel like when I started Earthseed and when I started my first and built my first ancestor altar before I had any pictures, I still don't have any pictures of Grandma Maddie. But she was the first ancestor that I honored. And then the other ancestor that comes to mind is a more recent ancestor. And it's my cousin Trail, who is my aunt's son. Who also died by the hands of the state. He died in state penitentiary due to neglect of his health complications. And he's been on my mind lately. Every once in a while, I think it might be the anniversary of his death, I think, actually. This time of year always gets a little touchy for me. He and his sister, Mona, passed away. Mona passed away recently. Trail died when I was still in DC, so it was probably like early 2000s, maybe 2011, 2012. And I don't know why he's been on. I think he's been on my mind because there's regrets with Trell. You know, when he was locked up, I could have done more to be in touch with him. And I think about just what it means to die in a cage.
Yeah.
You know, to die in a way where his death probably could have been prevented.
Mm.
And I wonder what that does to the soul.
Yeah.
You know, so I've been thinking about, like, on this side, what's our role when we're praying for our ancestors? You know, not just asking for things, but really praying for their own healing, because I don't think that the healing journey stops once you transition. I think it's also up to us to ensure that his soul finds peace, because he did not die a peaceful life, you know?
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you for bringing into the room not only Grandma Maddie and Terrell and Mona and mentioned too, but presente, here they are, right? And I think that piece of wisdom, that the healing journey is not just bounded by the breath, by one's walking and movement within one life, but also a transition beyond, and our relationship to be able to facilitate that, to be in relationship to our ancestors, whether by blood or chosen, right? I think is beautiful. And I'm really interested, like there's so many communities that have traditions that speak to ushering those who have transitioned into their afterlife, whether it's a novena, for example, in some families, where there's 9 days of prayer and an intentionality of a community gathering, so that the soul does not become bounded here. Or there are traditions from many different African spiritualities that also have an intentionality with spirit and herb and story and gathering.
Well, the biggest thing is to always keep saying their names.
Yeah.
Because they never truly leave us until their names are not ever spoken again. So as long as there's someone around to occasionally speak their names, they do stay with us.
And so maybe that's also the work of generational archives too, of like going back to the archive and reclaiming the names that have been lost over time. So,
well, the stories you present also speak to the two sides of doing generational work. And one is finding the story and sometimes finding great stories. But also I had a cousin through Ancestry.com find me.
Oh, yeah.
And he asked if I knew anything about his father's mother. And I said I didn't. And then I went back looking through the research and said, oh, well, I have a not so good story. So do you really want to hear that story about your father's mother? Because your grandfather did not treat her very well. So I don't know where I got this story from, but I said, well, this is the downside. So I know her name, I know something about her, but he did not treat her very well at all. And that's the downside, that we have to make sure people know that story is not always, oh, wonderful, great stories. It's also the dealing with the trauma. That's
because
part
it
of
also,
that story.
But that revelation and that recognition of the trauma gives context to what people are dealing with now, right? So, that hurt that happened generations ago, it didn't just disappear because the reality is that most times nobody dealt with it anymore or talked about it, right? So that still has effects until you say, okay, I'm reclaiming the names of my ancestors, but also the fullness of their stories. And not every story is like unicorns and rainbows and everything was wonderful, right?
Yeah, and his grandfather would have been my great uncle, because we're pretty close cousins. I hadn't seen him since we were very little kids, but I do remember him. And I said, oh, this is not a great story.
So you mentioned Earthseed. How did that come to emerge? What is Earthseed? And what's the work that it's done? All of that.
Yeah, so I've always been curious about my family history because, as I'm sure you are familiar with, a lot of Black folks don't like to talk about, their history when that history is traumatic. So I grew up with like piecemeals of stories about who I was, who my family is. And just curious and not quite sure how to get that information. My mom has always been very forthcoming, but my grandmother has been very tight-lipped. And I, due to these kind of breakages in my family, my mom being seen as like the Black sheep, she moved away from North Carolina as soon as she could. So I don't really have close ties with a lot of other family members. So that's always been a curiosity. I have always felt like there are pieces of me that I just want to understand that I don't know. And, I'm someone who grew up, I didn't know my father until I was in my 20s. So I've always felt like I've always been searching for parts of myself. And then I read Octavia Butler's Parable series. And, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's the main character this is an apocalyptic world. The world is crumbling. In a lot of ways that we actually saw in our witnessing crumbling. There's this, this person in power who I think actually his slogan is make
America
great again.
Yeah.
And he wrote this in like the 70s, I think.
Yeah.
So there's that, right? Like talk about ancestors passing down prophetic tools, right? Yeah. And I actually felt like that's what this series was. I felt like Octavia Butler was letting us know, like, I was about to curse, sorry. Like stuff is getting real. Stuff is getting real. There are natural fires happening in California. There's this virus going around that's turning people into zombies. There's this, dictator in place that's literally trying to like kill off populations. And she's telling people around her, like, we need to start preparing. We need to start preparing. And nobody's really listening. Everyone's like, we built this wall around us in our little cul-de-sac of a neighborhood. We're fine. Like, what's going to get to us? Nothing has gotten to us in all these years. We're fine. And then of course that, that doesn't happen. So the story is really following her going through this journey, looking for, literally, she's aiming to get to the stars. She's really like, this planet is done. We need to get to the stars, and not in this metaphorical way. Like she's getting these prophetic messages. I read them as from ancestors or some type of higher being that are called the Earthseed verses. And she's using these verses to guide her journey, but also to almost like guide, like they become her way, her value system, and how she creates community, how she survives, how she, what journey she decides to take, how she makes it through these really terrible times. So something about that really opened something up in me around this idea that we really need to start paying attention to what our ancestors have to say. Like there's wisdom there that if we don't hold on to and we don't honor, we'll be doing ourselves a disservice as the world we know it crumbles.
Right.
COVID-19 happens. The world we know it is crumbling. And not only that, but our elders, like Black elders, are disproportionately impacted. And it just became even more real that, oh no, like literally the wisdom that they have, we can lose, right? Like our elders in our lifetime, and I say this all the time, like our grandmothers, have seen a world before abortion access or reproductive rights, a world where they fought for it, a world where they existed, and now a world where it's being rolled back. If they don't have the juice, I don't know who does. Like they literally have lived through iterations of worlds where access was not available, but they still found ways to do what they needed to do. Then they were in the middle of a fight for it, and they have wisdom on how do you fight for this? What access do you do? How do you mobilize? How do you organize? And now they're seeing a world where it's being rolled back. So we need to be in conversation with cross communication. Like, what can we learn from them and what can they learn from us, so that we can prepare for this new iteration of everything: affirmative action being rolled back, voter rights being rolled back, reproductive rights being rolled back. This is all happening, this is all happening in the context of a whole generation's lives.
Banned
being banned, it's not a game, right? And so Earthseed comes from this idea of, we can listen to our ancestors and they can guide us through survival. And the archiving aspect, and the reason why I wanted to do it in a cohort community is because I know how lonely and scared I felt trying to go to my grandmother, asking her essentially about the traumas of her life and how she survived. And I just wanted to do it in community. One thing that the main character in the Parable series did is that she always found community, or community always found her. And that's how, I think, a large part of how she survived. So I'm always a communal girl. I'm always looking to do this in community. And the art aspect came from an idea of, I am a creative myself, and I know that just doing the work of ancestry, just doing the work of finding these answers, just doing the work of engaging with this history as Black people is going to be a traumatic experience. As healing as it is, it's the process of coming up against no information, right? Or coming up against really hard information. And I find art to be really healing. I find it to be an opportunity to really just process intuitively, and creating something literally that you can leave behind in an abstract way, right? So the Earthseed verses was her art, essentially, right? That she left behind. But in the moment, I don't think she saw it as art, right? She was just seeing it as God is speaking to me, and I'm just writing these down. And now we have these, this series of art, this prophetic work by way of Octavia Butler, that's now banned in certain states.
Which speaks to how prophetic and important it is, right?
Exactly.
So can you tell us about, how many cohorts have gone through, and what are some of the projects that you've seen come to fruition, as you could share?
Yes, well, I just finished the second cohort, so that's exciting. Excuse me. I've seen some amazing work. First of all, this podcast is
I know
an example
of the generations here. Cohort 1, cohort 2.
Literally, the dream. Like, when I was dreaming of Earthseed, this is the dream. This is so cool to see you two working together, to see you doing this particular type of work, and the podcast itself being an archive, like a living archive, is just chef's kiss. I've seen folks do, there's so many. This last year, someone actually created the Chutes and Ladders board game.
Oh, yeah.
That was just really blow my mind. So she created a Chutes and Ladders board game, and on the board are pictures of ancestors, pictures of draft cards, recipes, death certificates, birth certificates. And she's situated in this idea that the shoots, I believe, represent, or no, the ladders represent things that she has identified as like things that progressed her generations or progressed her family through the generations. And the shoots represent things that may have put her family back. So an example of a shoot would be maybe the draft card. And she talked about how war impacted her family. But the latter represented, I think, like her grandmother, like someone who really, progressed the family by way of healing, by way of nurturing, by way of support. I thought that that was really cool and like a really interesting way of thinking about archive, but also thinking about healing and thinking about how to play with that, right? Like creating an actual game for her family to engage. Another example was Shay's project where last year, where they did an interview with their grandmother, and their presentation was actually bilingual because their grandmother speaks Creole. So it was really cool for them to play the interview and you're listening to their grandmother, but you're also reading the transcript. And what I appreciated about that is it really gave texture, right? Because when people see Black, I think people like to flatten Black, but don't realize like Black is like big and deep and wide, right? So, our communal experience expands across continents and expands across language, and that Black language also, like Creole, for example, is a Black language, right? Like Black language can sound different ways. So I thought that that was really cool. Soraya's work was also really cool. I mean, everybody's work was really dope. Soraya created like ancestral items like architects. So she created candles. She did something really cool with, I forget the name of it, but it's basically printing, but using the sun to do printing. And with different herbs that had different medicinal properties. Kristen did the 7 Generations Back prayer, where she created a tea blend for each generation and a prayer for each generation based off of what they needed. Your project, really listening and hearing about like your 2 moms and just the archival work that you did with that, and the video montage with like hearing your voice, and then how that expanded into this project with your daughter, like this. Yeah, I can just go on. There's been a cool experience.
What's your visioning for the future of Earthseed, and how might people connect if they're like, oh my goodness, after hearing about these projects, I want to be in that next cohort?
Yeah, so I definitely want to have an Earthseed exhibit, like in a physical space where folks from the 2 cohorts can come and bring their stuff, and we have like this really interactive installation. That's a goal. The other goal is to do more engagement with the alum. Like, I don't want to lose connection. I want to know like what folks are up to, how we can support each other's work. The other dream is to have an Earthseed retreat with the cohort. And I want to create space for folks to bring in at least one family member to really continue the work around how do we make sure that families continue the work of family history and family archiving, but really delve into, like, I'm invested in Earthseed being a tool of transgenerational healing and intergenerational healing. So yeah, I'm working to really deepen relationships and deepen practice with the existing cohort members. And then eventually I am going to open up to have another cohort. I said last year I wasn't going to do another cohort, and then I ended up doing another cohort. So, so we'll see. But I am working on building, like we're going to have a social media page by the end of the month. Like I've been doing all this. I don't even have an Instagram for Earthseed yet. So it's very grassroots right now. But right now it's like really trying to get the funding. And when you're a party of one, you know, I'm more of a creative, I'm more of the visionary person. So having to be the fundraiser and, you know, all of that kind of taps into my creative uses. So that's why things have kind of been slow moving, but it's happening and I'm working on it.
That's awesome.
Mhm.
Yeah, we as alums are like, yes, all that sounds
Yes.
great. We'll be there.
Yes, yes.
And you know, my mom just well, my parents just bought a building in Western Pennsylvania for the traveling museum to have a permanent home. So, and we were talking about one of the visions. She's shaking her head like, what did I get myself into?
Mhm.
But one of the visions was also to have a space for an artist residency, because that community doesn't have a lot of arts programming outside of the community center. So that might be something to also tap into Earthseed's alums who might have an Afrolatcha connection to want to be in connection with that community. So shifting a little bit to your own archival, your own arts practice as well. You mentioned with Earthseed and one of the intentions with the cohort was also doing the work together because sometimes that work gets tough. And I'm curious about what are some questions that have led to good answers for you? Like, oh, I never text me. And then those questions that are like, now I'm stuck and I need to talk to my therapist because I'm so stuck. And how do you deal with the stuckness? So the total opposites of that continuum.
I think questions that lead to good answers, ironically, are not questions about the past, but questions about desires for the future. So asking my grandmother, what's something that you want to make sure the next generation knows, or what's some wisdom that you want to pass on, really gives you insight on a lot of times what they wish they knew at one point, or regrets that they might have in their own life, or wisdom that they wish somebody would have told them. And to me, it's a place that is easy to go for folks. And it gives you typically some more follow-up questions with so like, why that, grandma? Like, why that particular wisdom? Or did anyone give you that wisdom? Or is that something that you wish you experienced in your own life? Questions that have left me stuck.
And how do you work through that stuckness?
A lot of times the questions that have left me stuck are questions where the answers, I'll ask the same question, maybe about someone, let's say maybe about Grandma Maddie and who she was, and I'll get 3 or 4 different answers.
Yeah.
And the reason why that leaves me stuck is because you're just remembering that, the thing about memory is it's not stagnant, right? Like your memory is going to be different than mine. But also my experience with something is going to be different than yours. And the stuckness feels with like, what do I do with that information? How do I present that information? How do I hope? Because you're taking essentially pieces to try and build a story about someone that you've never met. And the way that I deal with that is I just honor that to be the case, right? And I present the pieces or I don't. You know, if it feels too disjointed, if it feels like it's not ready to be shared, if it feels like too big of a piece is missing, I'll hold on to it until either it comes to me, either more questions come. Because sometimes I don't always know the clarifying question to ask, right? And then trying to honor the pain, you know. I think what really puts me on my butt is hearing the pain in someone's voice, or even seeing the reaction, you know. Like my grandmother had a very staunch reaction when I asked about the father of who my aunt's father was. And we were good, we were talking about, you know, the family tree, the line. And then I just realized, like, oh, grandma, I don't know who auntie's dad is. And she said, we don't need to talk about him.
Wow.
I was like, can I just have his name? No. So that to me tells me a lot, right? That tells me a lot. And it brings up a lot of questions about my aunt's birth. It brings up a lot of questions about that relationship, what happened. And I have to sit with, maybe I will never get those answers. And I think the part of this work and part of the healing that I think just Black folks have to do is accepting that there are certain questions you may never get the answers to. And I think that's why, for me, believing in ancestors, believing in the ancestral realm gives me hope that maybe I'll get those answers, you know, either from ancestors or when I myself become an ancestor.
We have found that in doing this work, the information you're supposed to have gets opened up somehow. So we have had so many of these discoveries where things were lost. We didn't think we'd ever find the information, and then they appear. Like this recording of my mother's voice that we thought was lost so many years ago, and all of a sudden somebody has the recording that supposedly got erased, and we were able to put that up on the generational archives podcast when we were talking about her, that I was told it had been erased, that I had the last copy, got erased, and then my sister's moving, and she says, oh, here's the recording. And I said, you told me that was erased. Well, just a little teeny bit. So, okay, I thought it was gone forever, and able to share it with other people. You also mentioned a really good question. We're working on a project at the community center that I'm involved with my hometown, having young people interview elders. It's primarily African-American young people that go to the center. They're going to be interviewing African-American elders. So the question about what they would like to see for the future, I think, is a really good question for although they're going to set the questions, they may not think it's a good question, but I think it's a good question for them to ask the elders, so that they can give their thoughts about what they want the legacy to be in that. So I think that's a good question.
Yeah, I also think that your reminder of there are questions that we may not get answers to in this life, in this exchange of breath, that is individual and collective, and that we might in an ancestral realm. And like mommy speaking to the answers that we need to get in the time that is perfect for that answer, they tend to emerge. And perhaps there's also the question that we're asking is not the right question for that moment. But I also really appreciate what you said about interviewing your grandmother, and then the denial of information, which also has its own power, right? Because we just talked about the power of reclaiming names and their stories. There's a power in negating the whole existence of a person. It speaks to some great illness, some great ill that person has done in the world, and a refusal to allow that to persist. So there's even like a healing kind of motion within that too, that is like but I want to know, but you can't know because we're going to erase that. We're not going to delve in that area anymore. So it's complicated, right? Like there's some interesting choice in that and intention behind the refusal to give information too.
Yeah, especially around agency, if you are a person whose agency was taken away from you, right?
Yeah. So I think our last question is this. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? And what are you doing in this moment of breath, individual and shared, to become that ancestor you hope to be?
Oh, I hope to be the ancestor that leaves behind grimoires and spell books and journals of rituals. I hope to be the ancestor that folks know they can call on, you know, like I'm the one who's going to protect you. I'm the one that's going to guide you. I hope to be a very active and evolved ancestor. And I think the ways that I am moving towards that in this life is, living a life where I feel like if I pass on, I will be at peace. I feel like I am loved in a way that I can say, I don't know that my mom or my grandmother were ever loved, and I experience partnership in a way that I don't know that they've ever experienced. And in that just existence in that way of loving and being in partnership, I already know that I've healed a certain trauma in my line, So I'm working to live in a way that just is actively healing transgenerational trauma. So that when I do transition and become an ancestor, the generations behind me don't have to start at the same place I started. Yeah, so I'm going to be the ancestor that leaves. Like I keep all of my journals, and I literally plan on yes, I plan on passing them down. I have prayers. I write in my journal with an understanding that they're going to be read by later generations, like as if I'm leaving something behind.
I don't know, Raina, you remember, we wrote an article about and did presentations on being the last of the conjure women in our family. And so maybe we should think about not being the last of the conjure women and passing down what we know to other people, because that was the focus, that we were the last of the conjure women in our family, but we should change that.
We should. We should. And this is a part of it, I suppose.
It is.
Je-Shawna, I'm so happy that you said yes. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
This has been great.
This has been great. Our first guest that's not related to us.
Yay! I'm honored. This has been a lot of fun. I'm so excited. I love your podcast. I shared it with my mom. I was like, Mom, this could be us. She was like, I don't know. Maybe when she hears this one, she'll see that it's not so scary.
Yes, not so scary, lots of fun. And every now and then we giggle or we laugh with great abandon, maybe beyond giggle. And so those who are listening, thank you so much for listening. If you are new and you like and subscribe and share the news. If you are a frequent listener, thank you so much. We are so happy that you have connected with us and continue to share the news with others. And if you have just landed on us, you can subscribe wherever you subscribe. So Apple and YouTube and all the different places. And I think that's the end of our podcast. Is there anything I'm missing, Mommy?
No.
Okay. So I did a good job today. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.